Welcome back to another one of our question and answer times. And though this was not a specific question, there's a related issue we're going to get to probably a little bit later on. But I thought I would like to deal with the subject of depression. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a trained counselor, just life experiences, I suppose, and being a pastor. But we do find some examples in Scripture of depression. And we're not particularly talking about clinical depression now. Obviously, there's a place for proper treatment of those things by a trained professional. But sometimes we do get rather down and discouraged and frustrated with life, maybe, or whatever. So there are times that we may need to just kind of go back even to the Scriptures and say, well, what about depression? Is there something that is normal about depression, or when does it become wrong? When do I need to, make sure I do something different, or even confess it to God, perhaps? And so today we have kind of a depressing environment. Perhaps this is actually a kind of a favorite boyhood place for me. Not so much the cemetery part, but this area. And there's a real old church right here to my left. And we've had many good times there, but a storm's moving in, and we have the stones in the cemetery here all around, and for some that may give a rather gloomy perspective, and yet far more than just the gloomy atmosphere around, we have circumstances in our lives sometimes that are very gloomy as well. And as I was thinking about this subject, I want to maybe at least deal today anyway with just the issue that it has been common in Scripture somewhat. And I want to mention just a few of those to you. The first one would be Moses. If you go to the book of Numbers in chapter 11, you can see how he was dealing with all of the frustration of the people of Israel as he was trying to lead them out of Egypt, and they don't have enough, they don't like the manna, first of all. Or I guess they liked it, but they got tired of it. They didn't have enough water, and so there'd be different things, and they'd come raging to Moses, "Oh, what are you going to do for us?" And so sometimes it was so frustrating. That'd be the first F that we'll use today in kind of going through these different characters in the Bible. Is sometimes it was so frustrating to him because what am I going to do? That's kind of the way you can see it there in Numbers chapter 11. And so Moses dealt with it, and it was almost like, well, Lord, if you're not going to deliver us, if you won't get me out of this problem, then just kill me yourself, and don't make me have to put up with these people. So that was one. And sometimes our life can get frustrating. There are all sorts of things that come our way, and things we don't have answers for sometimes. And the frustrations of life just burden us down. And some of you may well know, far more than I would, although I've had some experiences where I just feel that heaviness, the weight on our chest of just, what am I going to do? It's so frustrating. I don't have the answers for it. And, of course, Moses was an example there as well. Another one we find is Job. And when you start looking into Job, really chapter, 1, 2, and then 3 is where he kind of gives the main part. In chapters 1 and 2, you can kind of see more of what was going on in his life and all the turmoil that he was in. But then in chapter 3, then he's basically saying, it'd be better for me not to have ever been born. I just wish I hadn't been. And obviously that's a pretty low place. And almost, maybe even literally to the point of cursing the day of his birth. And so, of course, we recognize some of what he was dealing with was the weight of it all, and all of the physical frailties, we might say. We could maybe use that as the next F, is the frailty of life, and how or fleeting even, how feeble we are. And so when we begin to kind of look through some of those things, then we see that, and he's become proverbial for us, of how much a weight he was carrying and how weak he seemed. And, of course, then he has his so-called friends that come and try to cheer him up, or really, I suppose what they were doing is trying to get him to confess his sin. So just on and on, all these different things that Job is dealing with. And then you can even go to David. And Psalm 69 is an example of that, where he's crying out to God, Lord, where are you? And it's almost like the water's covering my head. He's just in such despair. And of course, we recognize probably a big part of that was fear, because he'd been on the run from Saul so much of his life in those early days anyway. And so much was going on in his life during that time that he just cry out to God, oh God, why have you forsaken me? Where are you whenever I need you so much? And then another common one, very, very common for us, is that we think of the prophet Elijah. In 1 Kings 19, you can read about his story after he'd been up on the mountain, Mount Carmel, and he'd had all the people come together. There'd been 3.5 years of drought and famine. And so he's up there on the mountain. He calls all the people together. They have a test to see what God will answer by fire. And, of course, he was victorious. God answered with fire, burned up the whole altar, the stones, and all, licked up the water that was in the trench. You can go read that there in more like probably chapter 17, I think, is where you get a lot of that story. But anyway, if you start reading there and you see what's happened, let me just mention another one, is that then after the fire fell, then he went up on the mountain, he prayed, and God finally sent the rain. So there were two great victories, all kind of back to back there, all in a hurry. And then he runs all the way to Jezreel in front of Ahab's chariot, and everything seems great until finally then we have Jezebel saying that she's going to take his life in return for the prophets that he had killed. And when that happens, then Elijah rushes off to the wilderness. He's all alone. He's feeling discouraged. And he says in 1 Kings 19, he says, better for me just to die. I'm the only one left. And he's feeling so down and discouraged and frustrated, and maybe feel like a failure because he hadn't been able to bring about the revival that he would have hoped to have had. And so as he is there in the wilderness, then he is just ready to die. And so he too was in the depths of despair and despondency, depression, I guess we could say. So then there's one more, and I'll just mention that one quickly from the New Testament, and the story of Peter. At Jesus' trial, Peter was, all full of bravado and ready to go with Christ to the death, And then he denies the Lord and goes out and weeps bitterly. Matthew 26 is one place right there at the very end, I believe you can find that. And also, I think, Luke 22. The point is, it's not uncommon, and even great spiritual warriors have been sometimes filled with discouragement and maybe even despair, maybe got a little depressed sometimes. Now, that doesn't mean that that's okay, and yet sometimes it does happen. And today I would like to just admonish you just briefly here in closing. I know so far we haven't really given very many answers, just the fact that we see it in some of these key figures in the scriptures. But I want to take you to Philippians 4:8. And I want you to remember, and really I'd encourage you to go there, read it over again, underline it, highlight it, whatever you like to do. But make sure you keep your mind fixed on the things that are right and wholesome. And it goes through a whole list there of the things that we are to think on. And so often, even other verses right surrounding verse 8, tells us to rejoice and to pray without ceasing, or to make our supplications to the Lord. So there's several things there that when we feel in the depths of despair, it's time for us to turn our attention to what God has done for us already, and then also to pray that God will bring us through and focus our hearts and minds on the things that really matter.